here, and there's a lot here, y'all. Tim and Beth and I will walk through a couple of things that we think are really important to look at from our different sections. But I'm showing here, this is the table of contents relative to each essay section. And you see, this follows the this follows the exam order. And sorry, I have it backwards. The one you're looking at right now does not. It's old. Sorry, I misspoke. But in the book, it follows exam order. And that is significant because we want students to be prepared to see the things in the exam order, but you don't have to use it in that order. And that's a great thing about this book, and the things that Tim and Beth and I will look at is how you can move around in here too. But we do have some planning and pacing guides that we can also share with y'all. So you can see how we suggest maybe you integrate the book if you're using the AMSCO book in your classroom. But you'll see that it's organized according to the prompts as well as the rubrics. And so we start with the prompt. We always have some unpacking of the prompt. There's always different things different people do. There's things you all do. And the three of us, we try to be sensitive to that and saying, hey, here's a way to do it. But the lessons you can also customize for what you're going to do. We walk through thesis. And again, this is how we do it. This is how we suggest you do it. But there's ways you can work your own magic because we know you're working your magic with your context and your kids, right? And a lot of you, I recognize names from the Facebook group or from other places. People will say, well, I use this part of Beth's thesis. I use this part of Tim's thesis. And then this other thing that I've been working with my kids, and they really get it. That's the point, y'all. There's no way anybody can just take what Tim or Beth or I do and do the exact same thing. I think that's impossible because your classroom is unique to you. And so that we've tried to keep those things in mind as we work through here. But you'll notice at the end of each of the sections, we have a kind of a review of that and little activity, like a collaborative activity in a way. Then we get into evidence and commentary, sophistication, and at the end of both of those sections, we have that little activity. And then at the very end, probably what I think is the sexiest part of this is we have these essays, but it's not just a random sample essay.
You're just so you know, Brandon, I'm going to interject real quick. That is one thing that I'm going to focus on in just a couple minutes. So I'm just tossing that up there. What?
Being sexy?
Oh yeah, those are that's my favorite part of the last part of the chapter.
Oh, so you're talking about essays? Gotcha.
Yeah, the essays there.
Okay. I thought you were talking about being sexy. It's like, now,
oh no, yeah, that too, I guess. I mean, my poor wife, but anyway.
Well, at least it's not your anniversary. So the anyhow, at the end here, I'm going to truncate what I was going to say because Tim's going to get into it, but it's one of my favorite things because it's not just, oh, here's an essay at this level. Now here's another essay at this level. You and the students can see how these things grow across, and I'll let Tim do more with that a little bit later. But then at the end, we have a brand new separate free response question because we know we're constantly practicing, we're constantly getting feedback and things like that. And finally, the last thing I'll talk about, and we won't have time for this right now, but at near the beginning of the book, we have a small section. There's an introduction from me, but then Beth and Tim and I get the opportunity to talk about the most important things to consider. And the really, really cool thing about this, and this will be the last thing I say before I hand it over to Tim, is this is a student-facing consumable. It's made for kids to write in. It's made for kids to work in. It's made for kids to move fast and tear things up and dog-ear the pages. It's made to tear pages out and turn them in if they need to. But there's also an online digital component that I'll be showing you when I work with my part. So with that said, we've got some ground to cover. I'm going to kick it over to Tim. I will stop sharing, Tim, and you can have the screen.
All right, and I will unmute, and then I'm going to also shift to one screen over here. So I know that you're here, but I'm going to be looking over here. It's kind of weird. I understand. Anyway, one thing that I'm going to ask that you do for me is if there are questions in the chat, if you could just shout them out to me while I'm talking, because I've got my double screen going on here.
Yep.
That would be awesome.
I'll monitor, and Beth, you monitor too if I miss one. So
there is another Q&A in there. Beth and Brandon, by all means, feel free to interrupt me as you see fit. And Am I displaying my second screen? I can't even, what the nuts?
I'm not seeing it yet, Tim.
Yeah, I know. Because sometimes I'm a Luddite and that's what happens. There we go. There's my share button. And we will put this here. Good. So yeah, feel free to interrupt, feel free to interject, anything like that. I'm gonna just open up the chat now and we're good to go. Good. So anybody with questions, please feel free to interject in the chat. Brandon and Beth will hook me up. I'm going to start. So I'm just going to cover my three favorite sections of this, or my three favorite sections of chapter 1. I worked predominantly on the synthesis version of this particular book. We all read through each other's stuff. But we had one kind of section that we were to focus on and then go back and look at this holistically. So mine was the synthesis. And with my experience in the AP world as a question leader, as a sample selection leader and things like that, one of the things, and we all know this, but one of the things that kids struggle with a lot, even in May, is answering the prompt. And one of the lessons that's offered here for synthesis, and it's actually offered for every single one of at the beginning of all of our sections, is a lesson about breaking down the prompt to turn it into a question. So this is lesson 4 for synthesis. And as we built our lessons, we anticipated like 1 to 2 class periods per lesson. And so we've got this content. And what's really important, particularly about this synthesis lesson here, is that the prompts that we provided as example prompts in the book, for synthesis, there are 2 types of prompts. There are factors-based prompts and there are argument-based prompts. And one of the big kind of, controversies this year was that we had our first factors-based prompt on the operational exam, which was the digital exam, since 2019. So the first time on an exam that a lot of kids saw, we had a factors-based prompt. The last time that happened was in 2019 with the windmills prompt. And reading a factors-based prompt, as I was this past year, a lot of kids really had a hard time understanding what to do with a factors-based prompt because they didn't turn the prompt into a question to be answered to make sure that their thesis would do so. And so when we wrote this book, particularly thinking about the synthesis part of this, I made sure that when I wrote a prompt, we broke it into task 1 and task 2, and you'll see it here. But then I also give the strategies for how do we turn these into questions that kids can write claims for. So the particular prompt that I wrote is about aquariums, which is very hard for me to say because it's actually more appropriately aquaria.
I was about to correct you. It makes me sick to my stomach that you corrected yourself.
I know. Well, the problem here is this. I actually wrote the entire book as aquaria first, but one of the sources from the book was from the AZA, and even the official overseeing organization for all of the aquaria in the country calls themselves the Association of Zoos and Aquariums.
Yeah, I know.
And I was like, all right, I got to just change it. So that was a little bit frustrating for me, but we changed it to aquariums. But really what I'm asking is, what is the role of aquaria in one question? And then another question is, what factors should individuals consider when choosing to visit an aquarium? So we see that there are 2 different questions and there are 2 different types. And so every lesson has these 2 tasks in mind so kids can practice, so that on test day, if they see the factors-based prompt or the kind of more argumentative prompt, they're going to be used to that. But the big thing is that we give steps in this lesson about how to turn these prompts into questions. And that right there is going to help kids with just even the thesis point and arranging a line of reasoning from the get-go. So that's my most favorite part of the beginning parts of the synthesis, particularly the synthesis chapter. And then it teaches kids, how do we change up how we ask the question for task 2? And we give kids practice. And what's nice is, as Brandon said earlier, there is at the end of each unit a brand new prompt, but to work in each unit, we have 2 prompts. So one of the prompts is what we provide so kids can learn the content. And then we say, hey, go practice with a new prompt. And so for every chapter, you have 3 new synthesis prompts to use with your kids. And then so for rhetorical analysis, you have 3 new rhetorical analysis prompts for your kids. And then same for argument as well. But I really love this chapter that turns the prompts into questions, because last year, especially overseeing a factors-based prompt, I was like, wow. I helped do sample selection for the digital form. And there were a lot of times we were like, we can't award the thesis point here because the kids are not addressing the factors. And it's really important that kids know how to do that, especially in the stressful test taking environment that's there. And that's actually found, this particular lesson is found on page 27 of the book, if people actually have the book and they're like, oh, hey, which one should I do? Another thing that I want to just point out is that we tried to write this book, and Brandon, clarify this for me. I feel like you're going to have something to clarify, but we tried to make it so that if you notice that your kids are struggling with a particular issue in their essay writing process, but not the whole essay, that you can look in the table of contents and say, it's the topic sentences for my kids. And you don't actually need to have done all of the prior lessons. You can be like, hey, listen, we're doing synthesis. Check out this prompt. Here's a sample thesis. Let's look at what it says about writing topic sentences, because we want to try to do it that way.
Yeah, we did pretty painstakingly
Yeah.
try to make it to where, yeah, you may need to look back at something that was done, or an example that we give in a previous lesson,
Yeah.
but you don't have to have done that lesson to do a lesson if you're dipping your toes in for a particular lesson that we have here. So yeah, nice
Right.
idea, Tim.
Awesome. Now, at the end of this particular chapter, one of the activities, or this part of the chapter, section 4, one of the activities, once the kids create the questions in their practice, it actually tells them to articulate their positions. And what's nice about that is the next part of the synthesis chapter that I really appreciate, which shows up on page 39. So we go through this whole prompt breakdown process, and we go through constructing thesis statements and claims, and how to read sources with some purpose in mind. One other really cool thing about the book is that we linked up videos that can correlate with the lessons. And we did that so that if kids wanted to be like have extra materials to go home and look at, or if you wanted to assign more for kids, you can just have them scan the QR code or go to the tiny URL, and there'll be more support. There are some videos from Beth in there. There are some of my videos there, some videos from other awesome companies like Marco Learning. Tolentino Teaching is involved in this. So we got to really support a lot of other companies and people that we like to work with who really have a strong teaching practice. But I want to just go next to one of the things that we do in each chapter is helping kids to move from a claim to a complex thesis. And we talk about how to shift from just having an understanding of what the prompt is asking and generally responding to it, but also then creating a thesis that will help produce a line of reasoning throughout the paper. And we try to give ways, in this case, to help kids do that, right? You don't have to necessarily follow a template, but you want to consider doing this, because if we want a complex thesis, it should probably be a complex sentence. And how do we create a complex sentence? With subordinating conjunctions. So now we have some organic grammar built into this lesson, and the lesson is 2 pages long. And we have examples of how do we actually take a overarching claim and turn it into a complex thesis, and we show that to kids. And then that thesis will develop throughout the rest of the chapter as we go throughout the rest of the essay. Always having kids practice with this. So my example prompt is an aquarium prompt, but the secondary prompt is about electronic vehicles. And then the final prompt that's offered, where there's no instruction involved, but kids can do whatever they want with it, is really, really awesome. It was written by a good friend of mine named Scott Tiesenhaus, and it's about direct to consumer marketing for pharmaceuticals. And I was like, what a cool prompt topic. When he told me he was doing that, I was like, Scott, you're the man. And I'm glad that it got in the book, because it was really, really, really well done. The last thing that I'm going to talk about before I shift over to Beth and Brandon and let them talk, because this is just chapter 1, or sort of, should I say section 1, is this section that Brandon brought up. So we do go through thesis and then body paragraphing and sophistication. But the part that I love the most about this book is at the end of each unit, and I'm going to just find my page number here so I can flip to it. If I can find it, I dog-eared my page in my regular copy. Where is this here? All right, there we go. Okay, page 101. Awesome. I got to scroll down to page 101 here. But we have these sections that require, and revision is not the best word for me to use because you revise your own work, right? But we have these sections where we encourage kids to have a paper that scores a 1, 2, 0. So that's a 3 out of 6 points. And we say, hey, we want you to get this to a 4. So as Brandon said earlier, it's not just, hey, we're going to show you a paper that scored well. We're going to give you the score for a paper, and we're going to say we want you to write this into a 4. We have another one that says right after that says, here, why don't you develop this essay from a 4, which is a 130, to a 140. And what I love about these, first of all, is that some of my students actually wrote them. And so these are real student drafts. And I will say this, though, that Ethan wrote a really good essay when he turned in this draft for me. So we had to change it to get it to a 120. And that's why it says heavily modified. But it's nice to know that these are real student drafts that kids produced. But the other thing, too, is that what we've done is you can have your students read the draft and look at the questions that we are asking for kids as they revise these drafts. It says, the writer wants to revise the thesis statement, sentence 1, to more clearly project the essay's content and project a line of reasoning the essay will follow. Rewrite the thesis statement to do so. If you look at the next question, the writer wants to. The third question, the writer wants to. I hope you all, yes, all right, Rebecca, you owned it right there. That is why we did this. This is the writing multiple choice without doing death by multiple choice. And what we've also done is we've marked the lessons that correlate with the requests that we have for the kids to do. So if they're like, oh, what am I supposed to do with this particular part? They can go to synthesis lesson 8 and review it. They can go to synthesis lesson 12 and review it. And they're doing this from moving a paper from a 120 to a 130, and then a 130 to a 140. And I think that what you'll notice is if your kids actually really do this well, they'll actually modify both essays to be 140s at minimum. And so that this is the most exciting part of the book for me. We have it for all of the units, and I was like, I cannot wait to talk about this because I love it. I absolutely, really, really enjoy this a lot.
Yeah, and I think this is where the rubber really meets the road for all of this.
Yeah.
As far as students thinking about intentions of revision as they develop stuff. Tim, before you switch over, can you show us your bonus prompt?
Yeah, I will. Absolutely. We're going to scroll down here. It's coming. All right, that's our key point review. Here we go. Bonus prompt right here. Write an essay that synthesizes material from at least 3 sources and develops a position on the extent to which direct-to-consumer advertising by pharmaceutical companies should be regulated. What a cool prompt to use there.
Yep.
I just love it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tim.